Yo guys, welcome to another World of Warcraft guide. Today we are looking at my favorite, my main, the Unholy DK. Now, for those of you who don't know, of course, the Unholy DK is currently at the top DPS compared to, of course, its other spec in the current tier, which is Thomas Agares. And so, Frost, you can eat shit. Unholy, that's where it's at. Alright, no, I'm just fucking with you guys. Both of them are amazing. But today I'm going to show you how to play the Unholy DK. Now, the Unholy DK is extreme. It's hard to describe the Unholy DK. It's quite simple to get the hang of. It revolves around a very simple idea. Let's just put it that way. But it's extremely difficult to really get good at it. To essentially master it, it's extremely difficult. And even if you do manage to master it, you will end up making mistakes. And let me explain why. Now, the Unholy DK really revolves around planning. You're gonna need to plan that shit. It's all about planning, man. It's like planning a fucking wedding. It takes resources, it takes effort, and it takes management. And you gotta be good at all three, including that management. And sometimes it doesn't even reward you, man. You go to this wedding, you're stood up, and you're completely fucked off because your significant other didn't show. I mean, it's the exact same thing with the Unholy DK, because sometimes if you mess anything up during that rotation or during, what you're planning, it can really bite you in the ass. You can have a significant DPS decrease, which can really annoy me sometimes when playing this spec. But I guess that's what's good about it. That's what's so damn special about it, is there's so many different ways a good player can utilize the things given to him, the windows of opportunities given to him. And when it comes to this spec, there is a huge difference between a shitty player or a beginner to a guy who's been playing the fuck out of this spec and doing dungeon runs constantly on Mythic Pluses. Now let's understand what this spec actually revolves around. What's the basic idea behind it? So, with your ability Festering Strike, it costs 2 runes. It applies 2 to 4 Festering Wounds, which isn't a dot or anything like that, but it can be burst, and when it's burst, it deals damage. And your ability Clawing Shadows, which deals damage, will burst it. So essentially, you apply Festering Wounds with your Festering Strike, you burst it with your Clawing Shadows. So your main, basically a DPS ability is going to be your Clawing Shadows. It does a very good amount of damage when you're bursting wounds. And really, you just want your Festering Wounds to be constantly up on that target. You don't want to ever run out of Festering Wounds. Preferably 3+ runes at all times is the perfect amount. But of course, there's so many different ways that you can spice this up in a way and make, of course, increased damage. And it's just such an interesting spec, and I'll go over that in a bit. But first, let's cover the talents. So for tier 1, we have All Will Serve. Waste of time. Don't take it. It's not a great not a great talent. It's currently the least effective in this first tier. You got Bursting Sores, which is something I was using for a long time until I decided to go for the Ebon Fever. And what it does is, when you pop your wound, not only does it deal damage to the enemy who has the Festering Wound, but it does an AoE damage. So it's AoE damage Festering Wounds. So this is kind of like an AoE in a sense. Well, yeah, it is an AoE. And you also have Ebon Fever, which is your Virulent Plague, deals 20% more damage over time in half the duration. Now, if you don't know what Virulent Plague is, it's your plague. It sounds very unhelpful, I know, but you have an ability called Outbreak, and what it does is it applies a plague onto them, which is Virulent Plague. Not only that, but it also applies Outbreak on them. And what Outbreak does is any enemy that's around the person you have applied the Outbreak to will also inherit the plague. So again, this is a DPS, AoE DPS, and the reason why I decided to go with Ebon Fever over Bursting Sores is it's much more consistent. It really is. Bursting Sores, it really depends on how much Festering Wounds you have and how much Clawing Shadows you can do at the time. And what often happens in Mythic Dungeons is an AoE group will die very quickly. So it's hard to apply a decent amount of festering wounds, and then, you know, pop them, because it takes quite a bit of time. Because of course you need to wait for your runes to regenerate, and there's all kind of crap like that. So Ebon Fever is just a lot more consistent. I like it more. For your second tier, you got Epidemic, which again isn't really useful. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't want to go over it because I haven't used it too much, so I don't want to say anything that's wrong. Going on to Pestilent Pastules, for every 8 festering wounds you burst, you gain 1 rune. This is just helpful. It's very kind of passive. It's in the background in a sense. You don't really notice it happen too often, but it's extremely helpful to get that 1 rune, because you always want as much runes as you can get, because you're going to be constantly popping your festering wounds. Wounds and runes come off as the same word, by the way. I'm trying to say 2 different things, but it's hard to say. And so that's why it's helpful. Blighted Rune Weapon is also extremely very helpful, but I just don't like the idea that it's another cooldown I need to be aware of. I don't really like that. So I go with Pestilent Pastules. For tier 3, Unholy Frenzy and Castigator, I wouldn't recommend. I haven't used them too much again, so I won't go over them too much. Instead I'll go, what everybody seems to take is Clawing Shadows. And this is, of course, my favorite, because it just replaces Scourge Strike, and more damage, better, you know. For tier 4, I take Sludge Belcher, although some people might take Asphyxiate, because some people might like that more. But for the most part, you'll find most people take Sludge Belcher, because it does do the most damage. And it looks cool. It really does look cool. I mean, look at that. Look at that abomination. It just looks sick. For tier 5, we have Spell Eater. That's what I took. This is really up to you. You can do whatever you want when it comes to this, but I would always recommend Spell Eater, and I'll explain why. Is because in raids, what you'll find is some of the most deadly and most potent damage is magic damage, and the fact that, you know, Spell Eater anti-magic shell is 20% larger and lasts 5 seconds longer. It's just such a help when dealing with raid mechanics that could, you know, kill you very quickly. So that's why I always go with Spell Eater. Of course, Corpse Shield is actually very helpful too, but I've always went with Spell Eater. For tier 6, we have Infected Claws. That's what I took, which is your Abomination's Cleaver attack has a 35% chance to cause a festering wound on the target. This is also extremely helpful, although random. You can't really predict this, and that's not very helpful with this kind of spec, because it revolves around a lot of planning. It's just helpful. You always want as much festering wounds on your target, and so of course you also have this chance that you might get another festering wound on the target by your Abomination. It's just extremely helpful. A lot of people, though, also take Necrosis, which is also a very good one. But the reason why I don't take Necrosis, basically what it does is your Death Coil increases the damage of your next Clawing Shadows by 40%. The reason why I don't like it is it kind of, for me, it kind of takes out the fluidity of the spec. It makes it also very difficult to plan things, which again is what this really spec comes around. For your last tier, you don't take these. Just don't take Defile, don't take Dark Arbiter, unless you have the legendary shoulders, and yeah, maybe you can take Dark Arbiter. But man, Soul Reaper all the way. Soul Reaper always. Soul Reaper is one of the most important things, and it just does the most damage by far. It's just such a helpful talent, so always take that. Basically what it does, and this is a very, very difficult spell to really get a hang of, to apply it in situations. It has a 45-second cooldown, so you can use it quite often. It costs 1 rune, keep that in mind, and basically what happens is you deal damage with it when you use it, and you afflict them with Soul Reaper for 5 seconds. Now this 5-second window, if you pop three Scourge Strikes, or 1 Scourge Strike, or no, not Scourge Strike, Clawing Shadows, if you pop 3 Festering Wounds, or 1 Festering Wound, sorry, during this 5-second window, you'll get a 7% increase in haste for 15 seconds. This can stack up to 3 times, so you want to be popping 3 every time you use this. You really want to be aiming for 3 festering wounds popped during this time. Now it's hard to do. The reason why is because you're going to be using your festering strikes, which already cost 2 runes, to build up that, to build up the festering wounds. And your clawing shadow also costs 1 rune, and your soul reaper also costs 1 rune. So you're going to need to be constantly watching your runes, seeing how much regenerates. And keep in mind, only 3 runes regenerate at a time. So say even if you had 6 festering wounds on the target, if you tried using your soul reaper whilst 3 is regenerating, you'll use one of those runes. So you'll be only able to pop 2 clawing shadows, pop 2 festering wounds. So you'll only get 2 stacks of it, which is not as helpful as 3 stacks. Of course, that's a fucking given, pretty much. Yes. Man, don't come in the room when I'm trying to record. I need to edit this out now. The fuck am I talking to? I don't know. I just came because I was going to ask if you were going to sleep or not. I am, probably. Are you? Yeah. Right, okay. So make sure you finish packing your stuff. Of course. Because I'm going to sleep soon. Okay, I'm going to finish this video. Alright, moving on to the next point. Okay, so we're done with talents. That's it. Remushed. Finished off. Now let's go over the spec in detail. Now let's go over the rotation. Now, how do you want to approach the Unholy DK? Now the thing about it is, again, there's so many ways you can approach it. Now let me describe to you what I want, each of the spells that you have, and how I approach it when pulling, say, a boss or even a AoE mob pack. Alright, so, of course, out of the way, you want to use your Outbreak, and you want to keep your plagues constantly applied. Of course, you always want to do that. So, always keep watch on your plague. I have Tell Me When, which tells me when my plague is gone, when my plague is not up. It gives me an indication, which is extremely helpful. I suggest you guys do that because if you don't have your virulent plagues up, you can lose a lot of DPS. And another thing is, you always want your undead minion, to your abomination, or if you want to call it, to always be up. And if you don't, the amount of DPS you could lose out on is ridiculous. It's so annoying because I accidentally did a run without my abomination, without realizing it, and I was constantly looking at my DPS being like, why the fuck is it so low? Then I realized it's I don't have my abomination. I need it. So yeah, those are things just to get out the way. So of course you have your Outbreak, always want your virulent plagues up, you always want your undead minion up. And we got Festering Strike, we talked about this, we talked about Clawing Shadows. Now, Death Coil. Now, Death Coil is your filler, alright? Both Festering Strike and Clawing Shadows gives you Runic Power, which is this little bar over here. It's kind of like Rage for a warrior. It, whilst in combat, it stays still, but whilst out of combat, it goes down. So kind of like Rage, yeah. And it's your filler. So when you don't have any runes up, when you're kind of waiting, you're going to be using your Death Coil. It costs 45 runic power. You don't never cap your runic power. You always want to be using your Death Coils, because what will happen is if your runic power is capped, that means you're probably using a lot of your runes on Festering Strike and Clawing Shadows. And what will happen is if you use up all your runes, you have a very long downtime for your Clawing Shadows and your Festering Strike, because they're all regenerating. So from time to time you do want to use your Death Coils, even if you do have runes available, just to stop your runic power from capping. Now let's go into, let's avoid Death and Decay for now, I'll explain why. Dark Transformation. You want to use this on cooldown. What it does is it transforms, of course, your abomination into a powerful undead monastery for 28 seconds. The Abomination's abilities are empowered and take on new functions while the transformation is active. This is a massive DPS boost for your Abomination. Use it on cooldown. It's a 1 minute cooldown. It's not long. It really isn't long. So you want to use this basically in cooldown and in mob packs. It's very helpful to use in AoE situations purely due to the fact that your dark transformation, your Abomination, when it's transformed, does AoE attacks that do more damage. Dark Summon Gargoyle. Now this is your DPS cooldown. This is one of your biggest DPS cooldowns. And it's of course a 3 minute cooldown. You want to use this on, you know, boss pulls. So as soon as you pull the boss, you want to use your Summon Gargoyle. It's your DPS cooldown. Use it whenever available in a boss fight, or whenever needed extra DPS. And of course there's our artifact ability, which is Apocalypse. Apocalypse strikes the enemy, dealing 470,000 physical damage and bursting up to 6 festering wounds. Now get this, for each festering wound burst, you summon a member of your army of the dead for 15 seconds for each burst wound, of course. And those are pretty much your main. You know, this is your main abilities. And I'll go over how you can make this function together. How you can really plan these things out. Now, quick things I want to mention is you also got Chains of Ice, which is quite simple. It's not that, you know, big of a deal. You've got Army of the Dead, which is of course a 10 minute cooldown. Everybody knows what Army of the Dead is. Very helpful cooldown. A very important thing that a lot of people, new players, neglect is interrupts, like Mind Freeze. As a DK or as a DPS, in Mythic Plus dungeons, you're going to need to interrupt a lot of spells that happen. And Mind Freeze is it's an interrupt. So you want to use this whenever you need to interrupt. Of course, knowing your fight, that's very important. You have Icebound Fortitude, which basically is just it's a mitigation. It just decreases all damage by 26% for 8 seconds. Simple as that. You got Anti-Magic Shell. We went over this. Just absorbs magic damage. 1.8 million magic damage. Of course, you can talent it to make it more powerful. Alright, now, let's go over this. One last spell, but this is kind of not very helpful. Not the most important spell. Is Death Strike. It's basically Death Coil. Does less damage, but it gives you 10% of your health. That's really it. Now, okay, let's go over this. Now, from basic, you know, pull situations, what you're gonna be doing really is, of course, your Abomination is gonna be on standby. It's gonna be ready. You're gonna use your Outbreak. Diseases are applied, ready to go in, and you're gonna build up Festering Strikes. And of course, now you know, pop them. Simple as that. You don't get below 3 festering wounds. That's not what you want to do. Now, there are multiple ways you can approach this, actually. Now, your Apocalypse, actually, what it does, if artifact traded, it's this one in the before the Legion of the Concordance of the Legion fall. One of the ranks you can get is Apocalypse grants 2 runes upon use. And this works perfectly, and let me show you why. So of course we apply our disease. You know, we got your Death Core you can block, by the way. I don't know. We have 8 runes. So of course in the beginning of it you're going to be applying runes. So you're going to be using your Death Core. Let's say worst case scenario, you're going to be using 2 festering strikes to get at least, you can say, like 5 or 6 festering wounds, maybe even 4 or 8 or 7, of course. And now you want to use your Soul Reaper as much as possible. So the beginning of the pull, when your Apocalypse is available, this is the most useful time. Let me explain why. Because we have 8 runes right now. Of course, let's reapply my diseases. We can use Festering Strike. And by the way, yeah, we can use Festering Strike, and then what we can do is we can use Apocalypse to pop 6 runes already, and we already have 3 stacks of thing. And of course we're granted with Apocalypse 2 more extra runes, so that means we can go straight back into, because you're going to be using 6 festering wounds, we can go straight back into applying more festering wounds on the target using our Festering Strike, because we have that 2 extra runes. And essentially what we're given is a much easier time to just pop those runes. And of course, given that Soul Reaper, given that window of 21% increased haste, you're going to be popping these really quick, and it's just going to be really fluid. Now, of course, in this scenario, in this burst scenario, in this pull scenario, you're going to be wanting to use your Dark Transformation on cooldown, and this is what your Abomination turns into. And your Summon Gargoyle, ideally, of course, on cooldown too. If depending on the situation, you might need to vary. Now that's for the single target rotations. It's simple as that. And you may say, well, where's the planning come into? Well, multiple ideas. Well, first of all, you always want to have 3+ festering wounds, and the problems you're going to constantly find is you don't have enough runes to constantly apply those festering wounds. If you leave it at below 3 and constantly do, say, for example, do 1 festering strike, we have 4, and then pop all of them, we're going to run out of runes quickly, so we're not going to be able to apply any more festering strikes for quite a bit. I mean, 8 seconds is quite a long time until we run out of them, and we can't use any of our abilities. So you always want 3+ festering wounds. And now what also benefit that gives is the fact that you're always going to be prepared for Soul Reaper. We have 8 festering wounds, we have Soul Reaper, and we have plenty of runes, and now we can just burst those festering wounds. Now we have 3 stacks of Soul Reaper. So there's this constant, like, again, planning to it. There's this constant state of plan. You're constantly going to be needing to say to yourself, alright, how many runes do I have? When is it going to, of course, regenerate? When is it going to finish? How many are currently regenerating? So, of course, only 3 at a time regenerate. How many festering wounds do I have? And is it the right time for me to use Soul Reaper? Now, constant questions like this are asked when playing the Unholy DK. And what you'll end up finding is Apocalypse ends up being really helpful, because you can always match this to 2 Soul Reapers, because it's a 45-second cooldown. Soul Reaper is a 1.5 minute cooldown. This means that for every 2 Soul Reapers, you're going to be able to cast an Apocalypse. And Apocalypse is so helpful because you don't need to worry about how much runes you have, because you don't need to use your Clawing Shadows. Or there's another way you can pop your festering wounds. Say if a target has low amount of health and he has 3+ festering wounds on him. When he dies, all 3 of those wounds are burst anyway. So what you could do is, seeing a target with low health, you can use your Soul Reaper, and right before he dies, those 3, of course when he dies, those 3 or 3+ wounds will burst, giving you that Soul Reaper window. And Soul Reaper window is such a helpful DPS increase. It's just so useful, and you're gonna be constantly asking questions like this. Now, what really comes into play is when you're doing AoE. Now, this is your Death and Decay. Now, AoE, Death and Decay actually doesn't do that much damage in itself as an area of effect spell. What it does do, I don't know what's going on there, but what it does do is in this area that your Death and Decay hits, your Clawing Shadow hits all targets in that circle. Now, this is where a lot of skill comes in, is of course that planning. Now, Death and Decay costs 1 rune again. Now, you're going to need to be applying your Outbreak, that costs 1 rune. You're going to be needing to build up festering wounds on the target, and you're going to want to use Soul Reaper. But say you're in an AoE situation, so you're going to be needing to use your Death and Decay. What a good player will do is build up his festering wounds, use his Soul Reaper, use his Apocalypse, use another festering strike, apply his Death and Decay, and just go crazy with your Clawing Shadows. Because we have that 21% increased haste, we're doing a lot more damage in that area of effect. because of course that increased haste. But that's really difficult to apply in a situation like that, because it's very hard to get it to all function so well. And that's because, of course, all these things cost runes. You're going to run out of runes before you can actually get that Soul Reaper window, because you can't be using your Clawing Shadows. Now, what you could also do is, say if you don't have Apocalypse available, what I like to do is, of course, build up the... Again, always build up your Festering Wounds. And then apply my Death and Decay, use my Soul Reaper, and if I have enough runes, use my Clawing Shadows. So the activation of your Soul Reaper is happening during that window where you're having an AoE with your Clawing Shadows. Now, it's many things like this. It's just so many things like this that constantly get you thinking. Now, it may not seem too complex, but applying it in such situations, constantly managing things. So looking at your Dark Transformation, is it available yet? Should I use it? Looking at your Outbreak, do I need is my Virulent Plague still on the targets? Have I got, there's new targets in the AoE mob pack, so I'm going to need to reapply Outbreak to get all the diseases spread to all the enemies. And also things like Apocalypse, is that available right now? Should I use Soul Reaper now? Do I have the correct amount of runes to use Soul Reaper? Can I get those 3 stacks of Festering? Can I get those 3 stacks of Soul Reaper on? If I do use it, will I have enough Festering Wounds? Will I have enough runes? It's questions like these that constantly get you thinking when playing the Unholy DK. So it's really about, one, again, management and planning. So those ideas kind of intertwine, in the sense that you're gonna need to constantly manage your resources when planning to do something, when planning to open up a massive window of DPS. So put your Death and Decay down, use your Soul Reaper, and then get a shit ton of Clawing Shadows in. It's constant things like this that will get you almost in a constant state of planning how you're going to approach things, how you're going to do things. So, and with that being said, it's kind of like, say you're approaching an AoE mob pack, and you're ready to fight these ads. You want to do some big deeps because it's a really big one, and you've overpulled your tank, pulled way too much, and you need to get as much damage to wipe out this group. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be using your Dark Transformation, you're going to be applying your Out of Virulent Plagues, and you're going to need to be maintaining that. But you're going to also have to ask yourself, how can I get my Soul Reaper window available at the same time that my Death and Decay window is available, whilst also being able to cast as much Clawing Shadows as possible, so that I can actually utilize the Death and Decay window. Because the Death and Decay doesn't last that long. It lasts like 10 seconds. That may sound long, but trust me, it's quite a short lasting duration. It doesn't last too long. So it's constant questions like this, asking yourself, alright, how am I going to approach this? How can I do this? And what makes it difficult is really everything costs runes. I mean, your Soul Reaper, which relies on runes to make it so that you can get that Soul Reaper window. And the Festering Strike, which applies your Festering Wounds, which is so important, costs 2 runes. So already in that pull, you're going to be using at least 4 runes. So again, what essentially you're going to need to be constantly thinking about is, how do I structure my play to make it so that I can utilize every single, not only rune, but Festering Strike I have, and get the most DPS, the most damage I can, with the utility I'm given, which is of course the Soul Reaper, the Death and Decay, your Transformation, your Apocalypse, and the basic stuff like Outbreak and Festering Strike. Now let's go over it one more time. You know, just run over the rotation just one last time. This is what I would do in a pull situation when I'm pulling a boss. So of course I'd apply my disease, which is my Outbreak. I then use my my DPS cooldowns. I would build up Festering Wounds, I'd use my Soul Reaper, I'd use my Apocalypse, build up more Festering Wounds with the 2 runes given, and then shift between using my Clawing Shadows and my Death Coil. Simple as that. That's how I run my game. Of course, what I would do in a I'm waiting for my my Festering Strike to come back so I can apply more wounds. What I would do in a AoE situation is, of course, I would include somewhere in that, actually structurally speaking, it doesn't matter where, just if done effectively, my Death and Decay, to make it so that I can get the most damage in that AoE, you know, pack or mob pack. So now I have 4 wounds, 4 Festering Wounds. I have 3. This is a situation you might find yourself. I have 3. Well, at the time I had 3 runes. I could have used my Soul Reaper because I did have enough Festering Wounds, but I wouldn't have been able to get as much Clawing Shadows or burst as many, without Apocalypse of course, burst as many Festering Wounds to get that Soul Reaper window. There are multiple things you have to consider in that situation. What's an enemy? Is my enemy low on health? Can I use my Soul Reaper, risk it in a sense, to and if he dies, all that, you know, all those Festering Wounds will pop, so I will still get that Soul Reaper window. It's kind of things like that. Constantly process thinking, planning. You need to see, oh, what health is he at, you know, or when's my Apocalypse off cooldown, or when's my Death and Decay, when should I use that, or, you know, things like that. Constantly thinking, and that's what's amazing about the Death Knight. It's just such an impressive spec. It's such a glory to behold, because of the fact that there's so much that you can do. There's so much given what you are given that you can utilize to become a better player. So that's what I mean when I say the basics are very simple. Of course, it's in the name, the basics, but the getting better at the spec is extremely difficult because there's so many routes or branches you can like think of to approach a situation. So getting used to that thinking, that planned thinking, and then applying it to the said situation, that's what really defines a skilled Unholy DK. Now, this might be a lot of information to take in, and admittedly it is. Of course, it's an Unholy DK. But when doing Mythic Plus dungeons, this is recommended for all players. You will get used to it. It will come more naturally. Situations that you'll find yourself in will become more easy to deal with or approach because you will naturally know how to go about things. You will always have that constant plan being set up. I know it seems like I have a fetish for the word plan. But you always have that constant plan being set up in your head. Things like that. Anyway, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this, man. Fucking pain in the ass to record. I had to do like 4 different takes because like the hard drive problems and shit like that. It was such a pain in the ass. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, man. It'll be chill, you know. See my other content, see my other guides, man. It'll be chill. And yeah, stay tuned.